Well, welcome. I'm Andrea Hobley, President of the League of Women Voters of the Woodbury Cottage Grove area. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our program this evening. We will be learning all about South Washington Watershed District with its Deputy Administrator, John Loomis. For those of you unfamiliar with the League of Women Voters, we are a grassroots organization that has been in existence for over 100 years. We are a trusted source of nonpartisan voter education. Our program tonight is one of several educational programs that our local league hosts every year. The League's mission is to encourage informed and active participation of citizens in government, work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influence public policy through education and advocacy. I'd also like to share our nonpartisan policy. The League of Women Voters is nonpartisan, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties at any level of government, but always working on vital issues of concern to members and the public. So before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items. One is, and I see we've already got a question about this in our Q&A, is that the program is being recorded and will be up on our YouTube page, usually within a day or two. So if you'd like to rewatch it or share with others, you can look for the LWV Woodbury Cottage Grove area YouTube page, and it'll be up there. The second thing is we will have the Q&A open for questions. Lynn and I will be asking questions as we go, mostly at the end, but there will be some places for questions kind of in between sections of the presentation. So go ahead if you've got questions, ask them in the Q&A. If they don't get asked right away, we're just holding them for the end, but we will get to all of the questions. And now I'd like to turn it over to Lynn Marcus, one of our league members and co-chair of our environment committee, and she herself has a long career in environmental arena as well. Lynn will introduce our speaker, and then she and I will facilitate questions at the end of the program. Right, over to you, Lynn.
Well, it's my pleasure to introduce John Loomis. He's the Deputy Director at South Washington Watershed District. And John is responsible for developing and managing the district's planning and implementation programs to protect and restore the district's 12 lakes and 120 miles of streams. Woodbury Cottage Grove area leaguers may recognize him from the Hassenbach Woods restoration event that his watershed district sponsored with Woodbury. Our environmental group members helped with the flinging of native grass seed in areas where invasive buckthorn was removed. With a focus on local district resources and projects, John is going to cover the history of watershed districts in Minnesota, their role in water and watershed management, and how they are uniquely able to respond quickly to emerging water resource issues at the local level. Our South Washington Watershed District is a special purpose local unit of government covering approximately the southern third of Washington County, Minnesota. It was established in 1993 to address intercommunity flooding at the Woodbury Cottage Grove border. The South Washington Watershed District continues to work on addressing flooding concerns. However, its focus is on water quality and resiliency. And its resiliency work was recognized by the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership with an award for providing local leadership in climate adaptation and resiliency. Their office is in the 8th year of implementing its current watershed management plan, and it is beginning the process of developing its new plan. John Loomis has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies from the University of Kansas and a Master's of Science from University of Minnesota in Water Resources Science. He's been at the South Washington Watershed District for 15 years. And John told me that his life and career have been shaped by water, from early memories of fishing with his grandpa on the banks of the Cedar River. He lost childhood homes to floods. He's been rowing on the Little Arkansas River in Kansas, and he's worked on lakes throughout Minnesota and the upper Midwest. These places have given John his appreciation for lakes and streams and the relationship between people, land, and water that he's so used to dealing with. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks everybody for having me this evening. I was telling folks before this, I feel a little weird about the Watershed District 101 title, because we're all very different. So it's kind of hard to put us all in one box, but we can talk a little bit about that as we get started. Lynn, does that look all right?
Yeah, looks good to me.
All right. You all know me at this point, so I'll jump right in. So what is a watershed? So this is very basic level. We'll kind of build up from here. At its most basic level, when we talk about a watershed, we're talking about kind of a funnel or an upside down umbrella, right? So it's an area of land, a catchment. So the idea is all the water that falls within top of that funnel or in that umbrella makes its way down to the bottom. So that's what we talk about when we talk about watersheds. And usually we're focused at the end, right? So that's would be a river or a lake at the bottom of that funnel or at the bottom of the umbrella. So that's kind of how we're organized, how we organize the idea of watersheds. But that tends to make people think we're focused on that resource, right? But of course, what you end up with at the bottom all comes from what comes in at the top. So this kind of expands on that idea a little bit. So we've got the low point, an ocean or a river or a lake, and all the land draining off to that. So you got rain coming down, flowing through grass, flowing through trees. You have some water goes into the ground. Some groundwater comes out into various basins. You have all these systems, right? So evapotranspiration, evaporation from soil. You have crops taking up water, trees taking up water. Water running off of bare ground, carrying dirt into resources. We don't have anything on here for wells, but wells pumping out water for people to drink. So we end up with, a fairly basic idea, right? A watershed, water running off of it, carrying nutrients around, carrying pesticides, pollutants around. And that's the basics of watershed science, how that water moves around the landscape and carries pollutants around, cycles pollutants, metals, pollution. Kind of the characteristics of that landscape determine the temperature of the water, how much oxygen it carries, right? So it's a combination of these chemical, physical properties of the water that makes it across the landscape into the resources that determine what those resources look like. So we're going to have cold water fish, or we're going to have warm water fish, are we going to have fish used to living in dirty environments, or are they clean environments? So at this level, it's all pretty basic, understandable, predictable. If this is where we stopped, our jobs would be pretty easy. Of course, we don't stop there, right? We have people. And so we talked about kind of the idea of that funnel or that upside down umbrella. The water running through the top of that funnel determines what you get at the resource. Well, in our watershed funnel, all of that area in the watershed is impacted by people, changed by people. So that's largely what we end up dealing with at a watershed district, right? So we have people plant crops, they plant trees or cut down trees. They blow leaves into the street, plant turf grass instead of native prairie. Have livestock on farms, put salt down on roads in the wintertime, chloride, drive cars everywhere, pave surfaces everywhere, make a lot of connections, right? So we not only pave surfaces and build houses and buildings, but then we connect all of our basins with pipes so the water moves really fast across that landscape. And effectively, we make the watershed very efficient. So instead of, without people, right, that water slowly makes its way across the landscape, ends up in lakes, basins, soaks into the ground. Once we get people involved, the water moves a lot faster, has a lot more pollutants it can pick up, and just kind of puts those various cycles of nutrients and pollution into hyperdrive. So that starts to make it quite a bit more difficult. And if that weren't difficult enough, we then go and create a whole bunch of agencies. All of which are focused on one piece of water in that watershed. So we've got EPA and PCA at the state level looking at pollution and water quality. We've got DNR and Fish and Wildlife Service looking at habitat and critters. Water and soil resources are largely focused on agriculture, but also oversee watershed districts. Army Corps of Engineers looking at navigable waters and wetlands. Department of Health looking at drinking water quality, and of course, Metropolitan Council working on some supply and wastewater management as well. And all of that filters down to local agencies that implement things. So this is where we start connecting those higher levels of regulation management down to the local level. Folks at the Washington County and other counties, all of our cities, deal with everything coming down to them and all the different pieces of these various processes that they have to be involved in, some they choose to be involved in. Then we've got other similar organizations to watersheds. We've got soil and water conservation districts that also manage land area, but their focus is more on the land itself. And then we've got, because this is Minnesota, we care a lot about water. We have various pots of money that are available to local implementers to try to advance their priorities related to the environment and natural resources. So that's a pretty quickly we go from, very basic, simple, we just keep layering things on to where everything is all of a sudden has everybody involved in one piece of watershed management, their own silo. It's really hard to work across them, or people work on the same things and they don't even know about it. That's where you end up with pretty inefficient and fragmented management of really small local landscapes. And that's where the idea of the watershed districts came in. So people recognized this problem back in the 1950s, that we were trying to manage water on small political boundaries, right at the city border. But water doesn't follow political boundaries like that. So in 1955, the state adopted Minnesota Statute 103D, which authorizes or allows the creation of watershed districts. So these are small, independent, local units of government. They say at our local level are probably the most similar to a school district. But boundaries are determined by hydrologic boundaries. So the edge of these watershed districts is the top of that funnel. They all funnel down to a common resource. So in 1955, this was forward thinking in a lot of ways. Some ways not. In that 103D, if you go look up that statute, you'll actually see one of the general purposes of a watershed district is to fill and reclaim wetlands, which obviously is not something that is allowed these days in the state. And I believe that's actually a piece of 103D that will be cleaned up this coming session. So that 103D was adopted in 1955. A lot of these outstate watershed districts popped up pretty early on. A lot of them to deal with a lot of agricultural drainage issues, some flooding issues up in the valley. That was largely the focus, a big ag drainage focus, reclaiming wetlands. Fast forward about 30 years and looking more towards the metro, where we didn't have a whole lot of watershed districts established yet. But we're getting more and more people, more and more agencies, all with their own conflicts over various areas of managing water across a watershed. So the state decided that they really should have watershed districts covering the entire metro area. Somebody that could coordinate management efforts across political boundaries and hopefully make things more efficient and effective. So that's Minnesota Statute 103B. Requires coverage of the entire metro, 7-county metro area with watershed districts. As I understand it, at the last minute of adopting that statute, they made a tweak that allowed for a couple of different options, so alternatives to watershed districts. So this is where WMOs come from, water management organizations. So the entire metro area is required to be covered by a water management organization, one of which one way to fulfill that is with the watershed district. Another way to fulfill that requirement is with the joint powers board. So that's actually, we used to have quite a few more WMOs, joint powers organizations. I think often ran into the same issues that we had without watershed districts. So the joint powers board are made up of the various members within that watershed. All the same conflicts, right? So the board's made up of members from all the individual cities, none of whom were happy about paying for stuff in other cities next door. And it ended up with a situation, and actually our organization, I'll get to this in a little bit, ended up in a situation where each individual city would come forward with a problem or a project they wanted to implement, and the rest of the cities would vote it down. But some of them are pretty effective. It takes a lot of work, a lot of commitment from the cities to make them effective. But over time, a lot of those original WMOs in the metro area have dissolved and merged into watershed districts. Where these green WMOs come in is the statute also includes kind of a fail safe. So if a WMO is established and fails or dissolves and nobody else picks it up, the counties are responsible. So that's where these organizations, especially in Carver, Scott, and Dakota, watershed management role ended up being filled by the counties, and it is filled by the counties today. So within 103D and 103B, watershed districts are given quite a few authorities, including taxing authority, regulatory authority, basically all the tools we need to implement things, right? Plan work, go out, buy easements, enter contracts and agreements, bid out projects, do work, and pay people to do work. Oh, this is just some of the other general purposes of 103B. So this is that metro specific state statute, which are a pretty good reflection of what we do. I'll back up here in a minute. So 103D establishes a process to establish a watershed district through petition. And there's a few groups of people that can petition the state to form a watershed district. One of them are cities within the area to be established. A second group are the counties within that area. And the third group is residents. So residents within a proposed watershed can petition the state to form a district. And depending on which of those three groups petitions and where you're at in the state, you end up with different focuses. So when the group petitions the state to form the watershed district, they have to identify what the issues are and what the priorities are, basically what that organization is going to focus on at its start. And that purpose for establishing can be any one of these things, and it does vary quite a bit. So it can be to protect and preserve natural surface waters and groundwater, minimize capital expenditures. So that kind of goes to the idea of limiting duplication of efforts across different agencies. Identifying and planning for means to effectively promote and improve surface water and groundwater quality, establishing more uniform policies. So again, kind of that limiting duplication, improving government efficiency, preventing erosion, promoting groundwater recharge, protecting and enhancing fish and wildlife habitat, and securing other benefits associated with proper management of the surface water and groundwater. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and get into just a brief history of South Washington Watershed District. So we were formed originally following that second state statute. So that statute was passed in the early 80s. The first WMO was established in Southern Washington County in 1984, and that was the Cottage Grove WMO, which is this green area on the map. As I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, formed as a joint powers board. So the board would have been made up of representatives from the cities of Cottage Grove, Woodbury, Oakdale, Lake Elmo, tiny piece of Afton. That WMO fought quite a bit, did write a plan, but that plan was never adopted. Eventually that WMO dissolved, and then the member cities petitioned the state to form a watershed district. So that's where we transitioned from having that joint powers board made up of city representatives to a watershed district with an independent board appointed by Washington County. So we have 5 members on our board of managers. All of those members are appointed by Washington County from a list of nominees submitted by our member cities. So every 3 years a seat is up, and either the sitting member reapplies to be appointed or cities can nominate somebody else. All those names are sent to the Washington County. The county gets together, reviews the applicants, in a lot of cases interviews them and appoints them to fill the next 3-year term. It's a little bit different than probably most other organizations you've talked about or do talk about. We do not have elected representation. Rather, we're accountable to Washington County via the cities, right? So the cities have to nominate and renominate our members. The county has to keep reappointing them. And if any of those links fall apart, if our cities or county are unhappy with what we're doing, that's kind of their check and balance. At a plan level, I'll talk about our plan here a little bit. We're accountable to the Board of Water and Soil Resources at the state level. So it is Bowser that reviews and approves our plan every 10 years and ensures that we're following our plan. Okay, so 1993, again, still this green area. Cottage Grove Ravine Watershed District was established as the state's 42nd watershed district. 2 years later, it changed its name to the South Washington Watershed District. I think better reflecting, a watershed area, not just a city, but more of a Southern Washington County focus. In 2003, another WMO dissolved. That was the East Mississippi Watershed Management Organization, dissolved, and South Washington Watershed District absorbed it. And similarly, in 2010, the former Lower St. Croix WMO dissolved and was absorbed into both South Washington Watershed District and then part into Valley Branch Watershed District as well. So we are on a plan, a 10-year watershed management plan that we adopted in 2016. As I mentioned, we're going into year 8 of implementing that plan, which has largely a water quality and resiliency focus. And we actually are just starting the process of planning for our next decade of work. And I'll get to that at the end of this presentation. Lynn covered a little bit of this at the start. We cover roughly the southern third of Washington County, drained to 2 major watersheds, the Mississippi River and the St. Croix River, 12 lakes. 5 of them are currently listed as impaired for excess nutrients. Although pretty soon that will be going down to 4 because Law Lake is about to be delisted. 120 miles of streams, and that includes both natural streams and streams that are now in pipes underground. All or portions of 10 cities and townships. We have 5 managers on our board, and we have 5 full-time staff to implement our watershed management plan. So we mentioned a little bit, we do operate on a 10-year watershed management plan, the content of which is the required content of which is established by Minnesota state rule. And by those Minnesota state rules, we are required to have a section on capital improvements, operation and maintenance, information and education, monitoring. We have to have a regulatory program. We have to have an incentive program. We have to have programs geared towards restoring and protecting water resources. When we developed that plan, it's actually about a 1.5 to 2 year long process, engaging our cities, engaging our residents to identify resource focused issues and priorities and begin to plan out strategies to address those issues that fall within these required program areas. And then we actually do lay out a 10-year budget. It's called a long-range work plan. This is kind of a summary of our long-range work plan out of that 2016 watershed management plan. About half of the funding goes towards large capital projects. The other half kind of covers these other areas of incentives, maintenance, staff, education, planning, regulatory, resource assessment, watershed restoration work. I'll back up here a second. So pretty big numbers. Right, over 10 years, close to $50 million. So on average, spend about $5 million a year. That's a combination of local funding collected from taxpayers and also grant funding. In a typical year, we will collect, $4 to $4.5 million from our residents through a combination of ad valorem levy and stormwater utility fees. Most of our funding, and in fact, all of our funding for capital projects and watershed restoration projects do come from stormwater utility fees. So if we have any Southern Washington County residents here, if you're getting your tax statements, you're seeing a couple of lines on there. One we're lumped in with other levies. So we do collect ad valorem levy on every property in the district. I think the median value home probably pays us about $25 a year on that levy. The second line you see us at is under special assessments. And that's where the utility fee comes in. And the typical single family residence pays us about $50 a year. So between the two, you're at the typical home is paying in about $70 to $75 to the watershed district each year. And that number goes up quite a bit for businesses and other large property owners with a lot of impervious cover on their property, because that utility fee is scaled depending on how much water runs off of a property. So if it's a large property, large roof, large parking lot, they send a lot of water downstream. That has to be dealt with somewhere. They pay more into the watershed district to address those issues. And Lane, I think I mentioned this earlier. I wanted to stop once or twice and kind of answer some questions if we have any. This, I think, is a good spot to do that. Kind of through the basics of watershed districts and kind of the intro to South Washington, and then I'll transition to some of our more specific work here in a minute.
I don't see that we have any questions right now. So unless someone has something and wants to submit it here. Oh, here's one. Does the type of parking lot affect fees?
The type of parking lot?
Mm-hmm. That's just what the question was. So
yeah, I guess I'll read into that.
Yeah.
Are we talking about gravel lots or asphalt?
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
And so the answer would be no. We do consider gravel to be impervious, the same as asphalt. Once you drive on it that many times and keep putting layers of rock on it, it becomes pretty hard.
Thanks.
All right.
Well, there is one more here, actually. What are now there's a whole bunch. What are the 5 impaired lakes? Which of all the lakes is the cleanest?
Good question. So if anybody knows their lake names in Southern Washington County, but these red lakes are the ones currently listed as impaired. So this is Mark Craft's Lake, Loomis Lake, Colby Lake, Law Lake, and Ravine Lake. So those are our impaired waters. They're all very shallow basins, which we tend to see in the metro in Minnesota. We end up with shallow lakes that respond to our very efficient plumbing of watersheds, right? So we pump nutrients into them and become very productive and produce a lot of algae. Our cleanest lake would be Powers Lake in Woodbury. Also our deepest lake, strongest groundwater connection. Actually very good water quality for a metro lake.
You want to take the next question, Lynn?
Sure, we have a question. Do you have input into the county's winter road salting plan?
I wish I had more. No, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on. Chloride is, as I'm sure you're all aware, is a pretty big concern these days, and it's getting a lot of coverage. Thankfully, finally in the news. Chloride is a pollutant that dissolves very readily in water and doesn't come back out. So we put salt on roads and it runs off into the lakes. It tends to stay there. We do work through various planning efforts and our incentive programs to help our partners, at this point, cities, improve their equipment and get more efficient with their operations. So they're only putting down what they need to. The county is going down that road as well. They're working to improve operations and become more efficient. My opinion, just my opinion, is they're probably 4 or 5 years behind our big cities and in that path.
We have another question that asks, are you able to recruit people to serve on the board?
Cities do. So when we have an opening, the county sends out notice to cities and lets them know, hey, there's a vacancy on this watershed district's board. And the cities, depending on the city, will reach out to residents for those interested and take applications. And then those get, cities will review applicants, eventually nominate folks for our board that goes up to the county, and then the county goes through their process. But yeah, we do recruit folks. A lot of them come from our Citizens Advisory Committee, which I'll get to later on when I talk about our current plan update. Really end up with, luckily, at South Washington Watershed District, we've ended up with very knowledgeable, very involved folks who care a lot about water and water resources and effective management of them.
So another question, which legislative committee would deal with the 103D cleanup of language? If people wanted to watch for what committee at the state would be working on that.
Maybe someone else here has a better answer. I don't know, is there a generic government affairs subcommittee? I don't know.
I believe there's a legislative committee on water. I may not have gotten the name perfect, but they have been studying water governance for many years. They were involved in writing the first groundwater act in Minnesota. That was like 1989. And they are in the process of looking at water issues and thinking about aquifers and legislation to deal with current water issues. I don't have their name down perfectly. It's the Legislative Coordinating Council or Legislative Coordinating Committee, and then in that there's the subcommittee on water.
All right, that's good direction. We don't know for sure the answer, but that's a good place to look.
How we start looking.
Yeah. The next question is, what was that long stream that goes from Oakdale to the Mississippi? I'm assuming that mean the one that starts up in the Oakdale Lake Elmo tip of the green area.
Yeah, so that's, I mentioned we have 120 miles of streams, both above ground and below ground in pipes. So that's, what historically would have been overland, some perennial and ephemeral streams. Most of that is now in pipe. So not necessarily a named stream.
Well, we've got a good question here. How are lakes rehabilitated?
Yeah, that's hard. Right. So going back to the idea of, the basic idea of a watershed being pretty simple, but then you put people into it, and you change everything and plumb everything and make a watershed very efficient, right? So all the water runs off and carries pollutants with it. When we talk about impaired lakes, certainly in South Washington County and in most of Metro, we're usually talking about lakes impaired for excess nutrients. Too much phosphorus gets into the lakes. That phosphorus drives algae growth, nuisance plant growth, turns a lake from blue water to green water, essentially. In those lakes, the answer to rehabilitating them is to reduce phosphorus flowing to them. So that's where I'll actually get into a lot of our current project examples. We'll talk a lot about phosphorus, but that's the basics for restoring most metro lakes that are listed as impaired. It's reducing that phosphorus in some way.
I'm gonna circle back to the question that was asked before about what committee would be reviewing that update. The one that Lynn was mentioning is the subcommittee on Minnesota water policy members, I believe, and there's a link to that. I can put that in the oh yeah, it's already in the, so it's in the chat for everybody. And also a comment that the legislature sets up its own committees, so it would recommend checking with our state League of Women Voters for figuring out which committees are doing what in the current legislature. And that looks like that's all of our questions for now.
Thanks, everybody. So I'll pick up kind of on our plan a little bit. So a 10-year plan kind of looks ahead over, a decade of the kind of work we want to do. That plan, this watershed management plan, is what establishes the issues that we care about, and begins laying out strategies for addressing them. So this is where we lay out issues like we have 5 impaired lakes and we want to restore them. So we're going to implement work in those watersheds of those lakes to reduce nutrients. Or we're seeing chloride climb in several lakes. So we're going to develop incentive programs to get cities or the county to improve their de-icing operations and send less salt into the lakes. Right, kind of those big picture strategic issues and goals. From that, we do a lot of supporting planning work. So we'll do a lot of modeling work to help determine where the water is coming from, where the nutrients are coming from, where the salt is coming from, where we've made those connections too efficient, where we can interrupt that with various types of projects to reduce flow, reduce nutrients. Plans in partnership with cities or counties to look at operations. How can we improve municipal operations to further reduce pollution flowing into the lakes? And we also work at scales larger than our organization too. So I talked a little about partnering with our cities and county. We also partner with other watershed organizations and counties and soil and water conservation districts throughout the lower St. Croix Basin as part of the St. Croix Partnership. So if anyone's heard of kind of one watershed, one plan, watershed-based implementation funding that comes out of the Clean Water Fund at the state level, that's organized. Some of it is organized on these large watershed efforts that we do participate in with I think about 30 other organizations throughout the St. Croix Basin. So we do a lot of this planning work, but we also don't want to add to the already fragmented and layered management of water across our landscape. So we are very careful not to duplicate efforts. Our plan is actually set up that way. So there's actually a section in our watershed management plan on local plans that talks about how our watershed management plan ties into local comp planning. What parts of our plan do we expect them to adopt? Which ones do we leave to them? In the South Washington Watershed District, going back to its days as a WMO, it has been very careful not to step on any toes, right? So we stay out of land use planning. We stay largely out of permitting, right? We do set development rules. Those rules that are adopted by cities and enforced through city permitting program. We largely expect cities to manage floodplain and flooding issues within their boundaries. Where it becomes difficult on the edge of cities and where water flows across city boundaries, that's where we pick it up. And because we have tried to limit that duplication, where we end up working the most these days is in water quality. Largely because cities and counties have a whole list of things that they have to do, right? All of those various federal and state agencies gives them things they have to do, have to work on. And that doesn't leave them a whole lot of time or resources to do more focused work in these watersheds that we care about. So that's what the South Washington Watershed District spends a lot of its time and effort on these days, is kind of these planning around the idea of how do we actually fix up the lake, not just keep it from getting worse. And that follows into some of our climate planning. So I just wanted to highlight this planning effort a little bit. So right after we adopted that 2016 watershed management plan, which does mention climate change and the need to do some more planning around climate resiliency, a number of our cities started coming to us and asking us what we were going to do about climate change, because they were just starting to talk about it as some of their comp planning efforts, and they had no idea how they were going to address it, talk about it. A lot of them were afraid to talk about it, given the political climate back in 2016, 2017. So we ended up hosting a 2-day-long planning workshop, where we invited all the district residents who were interested, city staff from all of our cities, Washington County, our neighboring watershed districts, staff from state agencies. And we invited in some experts to talk about climate change and what that looked like in Southern Washington County, what we should expect for changing precipitation and temperature, what we were already seeing. And then we actually had some ecologists and natural resource folks too talk about, okay, if we do see those temperature and precipitation changes, what does that mean for a resource? It was frankly about the best planning effort I've been part of. Just the level of interest and participation of the folks in those workshops was incredible. And we ended up with these, what we've called cut sheets, essentially. So we had various tables set up at the workshops, kind of organized by community. So each city in our district got a cut sheet of what their residents were concerned about related to climate change and what it was going to impact at the local level. And we kind of grouped those concerns into 3 areas: infrastructure, societal issues, and natural resources. 2 of these fall within the watershed district's realm of work. One being infrastructure. So again, that the plumbing that connects all those basins and drains water off of a landscape. And then natural resources. Okay, so again, we're talking about the landscape that water flows over and through to get to our lakes, right? So any change to the land cover in a watershed affects the resource downstream. And then a lot of what came out of the workshops were societal concerns. These are things that, most of which the watershed district isn't involved in, but we documented them and handed them off to the cities and counties so they had a at least an initial chance to engage the residents and see what we're concerned about related to climate change. Ultimately, for the watershed district, I think it was actually it was kind of an aha moment. I think where we realized that when we talk about, at least the local level, the watershed district being a small organization that doesn't own properties, doesn't operate infrastructure. When we talk about climate change, we're focused on adaptation, right? So adapting and preparing for the changes we've already seen, and we expect to continue seeing into the future. And when we talk about adaptation and the types of disasters we expect, we're not really talking about anything that's new to us, right? We're still talking about floods, still talking about pollution, still talking about environmental degradation, losing trees, losing prairie, losing wetlands. Those are all things that watershed districts have been addressing and equipped to address, going all the way back to that first statute from 1955. What it does do is give us another frame, right? Another stressor that makes those disasters potentially worse. So we actually pulled this graphic from the World Bank in one of their 2013 reports that I think organizes how we think of adaptation pretty well. So we talk about those disasters of flooding or degradation, and those disasters being a function of people's work in place in the watershed, right? It could be poor planning. Maybe a development was built in the wrong spot. Maybe cities ran out of money during the recession. They couldn't go out and maintain ponds. Maybe we're losing trees to emerald ash borer so that soil is more exposed and more can run off. And now with climate change, we have more climate variability, right? So we get more wet periods, more droughts, more stressors, just all of those combined to make a disaster potentially worse. But it also means if we can go back and address some of that poor planning or poor maintenance or lack of ground cover, we reduce the risk in other areas. So we can make our lakes, our systems, our infrastructure more resilient to all change and perturbations, which prepares us for ongoing climate change. And from that frame, we actually end up in a place where almost all of the work we're doing at the watershed district level is adaptation and preparing for climate change. Enough so that I think as we develop our next plan, which will be adopted in 2026, I expect this climate resiliency plan to become obsolete because it'll just be something that's embedded within all of our program areas. This planning effort was recognized by the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership, local leadership. Pretty proud of it. I think the watershed district is pretty proud of it. What our partners were able to get out of it, and where it's kind of the path that's led us down towards working on water quality and resiliency overall. This is where I really switch gears and look at some of our local work. So this is recent work within the watershed district. I want to talk about it kind of from this idea, right? So addressing things we can address to lower disaster risks, which makes us better able to withstand ongoing and future climate change. First of which being our central draw storage facility and overflow project. So this is actually the primary reason why South Washington Watershed District was formed originally, was to address this intercommunity flow between Woodbury and Cottage Grove. I think roughly about 70% of the city of Woodbury drains down to Bailey Lake and the city's Bailey Lake lift station. They pump it over a hill, and that's where, before the watershed district implemented this project, the water just started flowing overland and didn't really have a controlled outlet. So over the last 25, 30 years, the watershed district acquired land, developed regional infiltration basins, and built an overflow pipe. So now we are able to, we have a place to hold all of that water that potentially flows out of the city of Woodbury during a 100-year precipitation event. And if we end up with a larger event than that, or a second event, we do have a controlled outlet to get that water out of the center part of our district and down to the Mississippi River. That system is set up only for those extreme events though. So these properties right at the Woodbury Cottage Grove border do actually sit dry most of the time, and they will sit dry most of the time. So this is all restored prairie. It's about 250 acres of restored prairie. It's open to the public. We are working to develop trails. And it will be the home of a future learning center and interpretive space. So this is where we get a chance to actually bring in some of those, right? So we were focused on flood control, but we also have a chance to layer in some of our educational opportunities, recreational opportunities into a space that we already owned for that flood control. And that's where in the future, and some of this will be determined by future development in Woodbury. So as Woodbury continues to develop and build out and road access and utilities comes past the property, that'll be our chance to build, an open air shelter. We'll get a regional trail running through the site, connecting the two cities, some interpretive signage, so people can learn about where the water is coming from, how it soaks into the ground, how their actions impact it, ultimately how we're reducing flooding and protecting water resources. So this is, very directly kind of getting at extreme rain events, obviously preparing for future potential disasters and minimizing their effects. We're also working at smaller levels. So this is actually an effort that grew out of our education program in our watershed management plan. So we had an experiential education program identified. We wanted to get out into the communities, hands-on, teach students and residents about watershed science, how land cover impacts resources. That turned into a partnership where we actually work with Carpenter Nature Center now. So Carpenter Nature Center staff go into schools around South Washington Watershed District, deliver a curriculum on watershed science, and kind of simultaneous with that we engage students and teachers in an effort to look at the school property and make retrofits where it makes sense. And in this case, at Lake and Middle schools in Woodbury, we were able to remove turf grass and replant deep-rooted vegetation, a lot of trees. So kind of restoring that land cover that absorbs more water rather than sending it downstream. Lynn mentioned this one at the start, Haston Bank Park. And woodland restorations is another project where a lot of our different program areas come together. I'm speeding up here a little bit because we're running up against 8 o'clock already. This is all city property. So we're working on restoring oak woodland, which the city has a conservation easement over. So that's a lot of the native woodland restoration work that reduces runoff to lakes and improves water quality. And we're also building a system of infiltration basins on this open space on the city property, which will treat water coming out of Fish Lake. So today, the Fish Lake fills up, dumps into a stormwater pipe that flows directly to Powers Lake, which I already mentioned is our deepest, cleanest lake. You can kind of see this water is brown, turbid. Right now that it all goes into Powers Lake. Once our project is done, we will actually grab that water before it dumps into that pipe. We will pump it to this series of infiltration basins where that water will soak into the ground, clean up, recharge aquifers. And a lot of that groundwater will then flow to Powers Lake, but it'll be clean. So this is a very directly intercepting runoff, removing phosphorus, removing salt to protect Powers Lake. Along with that, much like with that central draw storage facility space, Glacial Valley Park. We're working with the city to install trails and park features throughout this space. So again, layering uses, and not only is something that cleans up water, it's something that will be a neighborhood amenity as well. This is another view of that work. And some of the goats. So after the volunteers came out and helped us seed, goats actually came back in and trampled the seed into the ground. Wilmey's Lake was one of our impaired lakes. We have a couple of projects, which together actually should just about get us enough phosphorus reduction to restore Wilmey's Lake. One of them is currently in construction. So we're building an alum treatment facility on the north end of the lake. So this water that comes out of the northern part of our district flows into the north end of Wilmey's Lake. We'll grab that water, pump it up to a treatment building, actually treat that stormwater with aluminum sulfate, which is a chemical used in water treatment that grabs phosphorus. So that chemical grabs onto the phosphorus. We put it into the settling pond that we built. That alum that grabs the phosphorus kind of flocks out of the water and settles down. So it just grabs that phosphorus, sinks to the bottom of the basin, and clean water flows out of the top down to the lake. And then we can come in periodically and remove that flock material out of the bottom of that pond and take it off to be treated. So we're removing that phosphorus directly from the water rather than letting it go into the lake. And the second project, which has been operational now for a couple of summers, on the east side of Wilmey's Lake. This is actually over here at Seasons Park. This is a passive filter, so water flows out of an existing city pond into a constructed basin filled with crushed limestone rock. This crushed limestone rock happens to be pretty good at grabbing onto phosphorus as well. So as that water percolates through this crushed rock, a lot of that phosphorus is removed and clean water flows downstream to Wilmey's Lake. Trout Brook Stream Restoration is another project that's currently underway. This is more on the habitat and wildlife side of things, but also benefits the St. Croix River by reducing sediment flow. So Trout Brook has been heavily impacted by people over the last century. First with logging and then agriculture, and how hobby farms really disrupted the hydrology of that stream and threw it out of balance. For the stream, the old stream is buried in sand, and then you have a lot of erosion with that stream trying to cut back down to a stable form. So we actually went in over 3 phases and recreated a natural stream channel so that energy is dissipated within that stream channel rather than cutting banks and causing erosion. And then along with that, it gives us a chance to physically reconstruct different habitat features within that trout stream. So we get pools, riffles, and runs. This has been a lot different than a stormwater project in Woodbury. Physically working in a trout stream to bring trout back. It's been very successful. Before we started work down at Trout Brook, the DNR would occasionally find trout sporadically throughout the stream. Last time they surveyed it a couple springs ago, after 2 of our 3 phases were finished, they were finding hundreds of trout throughout all the reaches of the stream. Kind of continuing that idea of retrofitting existing systems and working with cities. So a lot of our East Mississippi WMO areas had storm sewer pipes that long predated the establishment of any watershed districts, discharging directly to the river. So we actually go in and where we can kind of interrupt those straight pipes and install various projects to filter that water out. So this is essentially retrofitting aging city systems to treat stormwater as we would expect it to be treated today with any new development. Again, kind of making up for some of that past development, past mismanagement, past lack of maintenance. And just about wrapping up here. Working with cities on operations. So working with the city of Woodbury and then this coming year, city of Cottage Grove as well to enhance their street sweeping operations. So trying to grab some of that leaf material and sand and debris on the city streets before it makes it into resources and causes a problem. Funding city upgrades to de-icing equipment, so they're only putting down how much salt they actually need. Working with cities to maintain BMPs and stay on top of maintenance so they don't fail and cause downstream water quality or flooding issues. Skip through some of this. I know we're running out of time here. I'll just kind of plug, we're just starting our next plan update process with both our board of managers and our citizens advisory committee. I hope residents will see some of this information come out this spring, and we'll certainly try to get it out through the League of Women Voters email lists. We'll actually be soliciting citizen input, probably hosting a couple of planning workshops this summer for the purpose of identifying the issues that our residents are currently concerned about. So looking ahead towards our, our next year 10-year plan, what issues do our residents feel are most important? What do you want us working on for those 10 years? That's where we're just kind of picking up the process. So look for that.
I was going to ask a follow-up question about that, the 10-year plan. So it sounds like one way to get involved is to, participate in that, what you were just mentioning. Beyond that, I mean, is there sort of a public participation in the process, or is it just sort of that initial gathering information?
Yeah, it is a long process. So this, 2024, we will be focused on getting public input, right? So really, we want to hear from people what their concerns are, what the issues are within the district that somebody needs to work on, right? And we'll do that with, the story map we're going to blast out to people. We'll have a survey in it. So people will have a chance, a web survey link to give us input. We'll also be at various community events this coming year to talk to folks. Probably have a couple of grand opening events at Hassan Bank when that park space is finished and at Trout Brook when we open up the new stream channel. But yeah, we'll be at events, we'll be sending information out, and we'll be at some point probably recruiting people to participate in planning workshops.
Right. How do people get signed up for your emails?
Send me an email.
Okay, great. Well, if you don't mind, we can get into our other questions. Is now a good time for that?
Yeah.
All right. And it's okay if we're going a little over 8. I know we kind of roughly plan about an hour, but it's pretty common for our Q&A to go quarter after or so. So no worries about the time. So I'm going to ask one that I think we kind of had 2 parts, and I want to make sure to get tied together. So one of the questions was, tell us what appears to be expediting or why it appears to be that expediting water runoff is better than allowing water to be more naturally be absorbed by the environment. And what she was referring to is your reference to water being channeled to underground pipes. I was wondering if that had more to do with flood control, but maybe you can answer that, as if there's a benefit to
yeah, it's not better,
it,
right?
or if it depends on the situation. I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's not better, right? So that's, as people have developed watersheds, we connect things, right? To get water off the landscape, right? So we become very efficient at moving water downstream and giving our problems to somebody else, right? So infrastructure is great for protecting your own backyard or your own city. It can cause problems downstream. Now, those problems are a lot of the times are what watershed districts end up working on. And so that's where we end up going back, trying to rebuild basins to retain water, implement projects to treat water. Basically, we're trying to rebuild that natural hydrology of a landscape after it has been plumbed with storm sewer.
Lynn, do you want to ask the next question? Oh, Lynn, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. How
Period.
does development affect the watersheds with loss of mature trees and more runoff with the manicured lawns?
Yeah, that's something we're still trying to understand, frankly, the role of trees. We do know that woodlands, right? So large areas of large mature trees soak up a lot of water and don't have a lot of runoff. What I think the science community is still trying to figure out is the benefit of individual trees, right? So we think of a suburban landscape with, one tree in the front yard. I think it's still unclear of the benefit of that single individual tree and preventing water from running downstream. And then the part of, the manicured lawns. I guess in my mind, I don't compare and contrast trees with lawns. I compare and contrast deep-rooted native vegetation with lawns, right? Because those deep roots are what better allow water to soak into the ground, and just the way that native vegetation gets matted up, right, intercepts more water, holds it longer, lets it soak in deeper into the ground. And we lose that when we transition to manicured lawns. But even, within the category of manicured lawns, there's a lot of variability, right? If you have, really thick, dense grass on your property and you leave it longer in the summer, it probably doesn't have a lot of water running off of it either. But if it is thin, it's short, you have bare spots in your yard, that's sending a lot of water and a lot of soil and a lot of nutrients downstream.
So, John, do you want to say something about rain gardens? The city of Woodbury has actually put some in, and I think a lot of people are not familiar with the concept of rain gardens that do not need to have flowers.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of rain gardens too. Probably the ones you're talking about, Lynn, are watershed district rain gardens. Rain gardens are, small planted areas. They can be small, they can be large. In your front yard, next to a downspout, off the side of a stream, or a side of a street in the city right of way. Small depressions that collect water and allow it to soak into the ground. Those are usually planted with some kind of plants. It can be perennial vegetation, it can be shrubs. Some of them can even be planted with turf grass. Again, kind of goes to that idea of rebuilding more of a natural hydrograph, right? Hydrograph is how much water runs off of landscape and how it runs off of a landscape. So giving that water a chance to soak in rather than just get into a pipe. That's essentially what a rain garden is. In theory, they're great, right? You need a lot of them to make a difference. So it becomes a bit of a challenge for small organization from that standpoint of getting enough of them to make a sizable impact. Some cases we've been able to do that, really get them targeted and get pretty good coverage throughout a neighborhood. For instance, on the west side of Colby Lake, you've probably got about 40 or 50 rain gardens in there that are making a pretty good difference. All along Interlochen Drive in Woodbury, we have a series of rain gardens that grab a lot of water and make a big difference.
And those are filled with shrubs, a lot of red osier dogwood, and create a lot of shrubby habitat.
We have found though that they are great, and they're great for dispersed treatment. They weren't moving the needle enough for us on restoration, so achieving our resource goals, so that we weren't getting enough of them in the ground quickly enough to improve resources. It was helping us keep them from getting worse, but it wasn't improving things. So that's where we've had to go to these larger, more regional projects, the Hassan Bank and the Alum Treatment Facility.
John, we have another question that asks if any of the streams are being daylighted, like what has happened at Phelan Creek.
Not for us. It's a very cool idea, and it's been cool to see that and I primarily at Capital Region Watershed District, Ramsey Washington Metro Watershed District have done a lot of that work. for a couple of different reasons. One, again, trying to slow water down and get it to move across the landscape naturally again, but also bringing resources back to the forefront for people to actually see and interact with, right? So many of those urban landscapes are devoid of water now because it's all underground and people don't realize they have water resources. So it's been cool to see.
Maybe could either of you explain what that means, daylighting?
Oh, sorry.
No,
Yeah,
it's
so
okay.
that's, we talked about that stream running north to south through our district, from Oakdale down to the river, and most of that being in pipes. So daylighting is bringing that stream back out of the pipe and putting it back at the surface.
One of the other questions we had was that someone had heard that, like from an NPR program, that potassium chloride was better for residential use than salt water softeners. Is its impact on wastewater better?
I don't know if potassium chloride is better for softeners. There has been some recent discussion, especially kind of in tandem with the PFAS and water treatment plant discussion, of the benefit of regional softening. Right. So right now in Southern Washington County, if people want soft water, they have their own water softener in their basement. As those softeners work, they create a concentrated chloride slurry that discharges and gets treated at the treatment plant, which doesn't do a great job of removing chloride from wastewater. Right. So a lot of that chloride just ends up going downstream. If communities could go to a regional softening system to where, water is treated and then softened and then distributed to homes, and they don't have to have their own softener, that softening process would be more efficient and there'd be less chloride used and less chloride sent downstream. It's extremely expensive. So that it's kind of at this point, I think it's probably it's a regional issue. It'd have to be a Met Council or state driven response for the purpose of reducing chloride going to treatment plants and coming out of treatment plants.
We have another question about the impact of people. The question is, over time, how are the interstates like 94 and other state highways and county roads impacting the watershed district?
Yeah, that all goes to that same discussion of plumbing a watershed, right? We pave roads and we put pipes in the ground and we move water faster and faster across the landscape. It really disrupts everything, right? It changes how the nutrients flow across the landscape. It changes how many nutrients get into a lake or into a stream, causes erosion. And it's part of, we live in it, right? So that's how we live, and it's something we have to learn to accommodate and live with, and hopefully reduce its impact somehow.
I see one more question here. Are underlying aquifers considered to be part of your watershed district? And I'm thinking we might want to explain what an aquifer is for everybody.
Which I think I got up to the start here. So aquifers are the underground water, right? So underground pools of water kind of made up in voids of bedrock beneath our feet. So it's the underground source of, my dog's gonna start barking now, underground source of water that all of our residents' water comes from, drinking water comes from. And here we're talking about Jordan, Prairie du Chien, Tunnel City, St. Peter, all the different bedrock formations that hold groundwater underneath of us. Those are our aquifers that we talk about. And they are, certainly we consider them part of our district, right? But if you think of the idea of a watershed, And ours is at the surface of our district is pretty easily defined because it's all the land area that drains to our water resources that we see. The watershed, if you will, of an aquifer is enormous, and it goes far beyond even our watershed district's boundaries. So we certainly think about them and how we interact with those aquifers, right? We want to protect them. We want to limit how much water we pull out of them. We want to try to recharge them where possible. It is a lot bigger than just us.
I had a question myself, actually, when you showed the budget and you just went past that page again, there was a large proportion that was about incentives. I can't remember if it was 14% or something. Where do those generally go to? Are those going to like cities, businesses, individuals,
Yeah.
or how do those kind of go out into the community? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. It's a few different incentive programs. So we have our two biggest incentive programs open to different groups of people. One is a general residential cost share program. So any resident in South Washington Watershed District is eligible for our cost share program. So if somebody has an idea of something they want to do in their backyard, put in a rain garden, put in a swale, convert turf to deep-rooted vegetation and trees, you're probably eligible for cost share funding. If you want to do something to benefit water quality, but you don't know what, we can arrange to have some of our staff or some Washington Conservation District staff come out, do a site visit and help you brainstorm some ideas. Ultimately, those incentives for individual residents, if it's a good project with a good benefit, the cost share grant will probably pay for about half of it. Our larger incentive program is geared towards municipalities, so that we call it our coordinated capital improvement program is actually open right now for cities and the county to apply for grants to help them incorporate improvements into their larger projects and operations to improve water quality. So that's the program we actually use to fund de-icing improvements with cities, help cities purchase new sweepers for street sweeping, build large filtration basins, stabilize ravines. A lot of that kind of work comes out of that kind of more city-facing incentive program.
Great, thanks. Well, I don't see any other questions. I want to end on just sort of a great question that league members tend to ask, and that is, you know, where are ways, we've already talked about the 10-year plan, but how are ways that people can get involved as citizens if this is something that they care about?
Really do contact us and get involved in that plan update process. We do have a citizens advisory committee that meets quarterly. You can always use more members. So if it's something you really care about and want to be involved in on an ongoing basis, there's room for that. So you would have a chance to help us form that next plan and then help us implement it for the next decade potentially. Big commitment. I don't know if you wanted that much, but
No, it's all right. I mean, these are the kinds of things that you know, we do have people that are really interested in things like that. So well, I think that wraps it up for us, unless you have any kind of final comments you want to make, John.
no.
All right. Well, then thank you again to John Loomis for great information and for answering all of our questions tonight, and to the audience as well for asking really great questions, and also to Lynn Marcus for hosting with me tonight. Thank you to our viewers for attending the program. And if anyone, as a reminder, if you want to share with others, this will be available on our league YouTube channel. There is a link in the chat. Otherwise, it's if you just go to YouTube and search LVW, LWV, Woodbury Cottage Grove area, it'll come up. Just a few other announcements about upcoming programs. Our annual legislative interviews are coming up on Saturday, February 10th at 9 a.m. So that's a morning program on a Saturday. We will talk to our local state representatives ahead of the start of the 2024 legislative session. You can register to watch it live as a Zoom webinar. Otherwise, the replay will be available on our YouTube channel and also rebroadcast on SWCTC. The registration link is on our blog on our website, which you can find under updates, but I'm also just going to put it in the chat because I've got it here right there. And then on February 26th, there's a Monday evening program for just members. It's our annual program planning meeting. So if you're a member, check your newsletter. February newsletter is coming out soon for that. Again, that's February 26th at 7 p.m. It's a Monday night. And then just to save the dates that we have programs we have coming up, but we don't have full, you know, I don't have a post to direct you to on the website yet, but the art, craft, and science of community policing. That's going to be a panel discussion with local public safety directors and chiefs of police. That's on Monday, March 18th at 7 o'clock on Zoom. And then we have an update on the gold line. That's going to be on Monday, April 15th at 7 p.m. on Zoom. So again, the policing one is March 18th and the gold line is April 15th. So you can save the date for those and watch for more information. Thank you again all for joining us this evening. Good night.